Hi guys, my name is Minhajuddin Ansari and you're watching the 31st tutorial on C programming, and today I'll be talking about static and dynamic arrays. So you're already familiar with static arrays because we've used them a lot in our previous tutorials. So let me give you an example of a static single dimensional array. So I'm going to define my integer array num of size 5 and I'm going to initialize it to 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So this is an example of a static single dimensional array. Similarly, I can also define a static multi-dimensional array by increasing my subscripts. So this is an example of a static two-dimensional array and I've initialized it to 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what exactly are static arrays? Static arrays are arrays whose size is defined during the compile time of your program. That means you must specify the size of your static array before your code is compiled. And before your code is compiled, and the size of the static array is fixed. So you cannot change it once you have specified the size of your static array. So let me prove my argument. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to define an integer variable size, and I'm going to ask the user to enter the size of the array during the runtime of the program. So after the program is compiled and while the program is running, I'm going to request the user to enter the size of the array, and I can do that using the scanf function. So I'm going to take an integer input and I'm going to store it inside the integer variable size. And in the end, I'm going to define my integer variable num, and its size will be the size entered by the user. So now when I run the program, the compiler will give me an error because I'm specifying the size during the runtime of the program. This is not allowed. The size of the static array can only be specified before your code is compiled. So this is illegal. So now you might be wondering, hey, how can I create arrays during the runtime of my program? How can I create dynamic arrays? And the term dynamic array is used when you're creating arrays during the runtime of a program. So you can create dynamic arrays using dynamic memory allocation functions. And let me give you an example of that. So first I'm going to define my integer pointer ptr and I'm going to write my dynamic memory allocation function. And dynamic memory allocation functions will simply dynamically allocate space inside your main memory inside your RAM. And dynamically allocate space means that space will be allocated while your program is running. And how much space will be allocated? Well, you can define that in the parentheses. You can define that as the argument to the dynamic memory allocation function. So for example, I want to allocate 5 bytes of space during the runtime of my program. So simply I can write 5 right here. So what this will do is that while my program is running, it will reserve 5 bytes of space in my main memory. And this will all happen while my program is running. That is why this is called dynamic memory allocation function. It allocates 5 bytes of memory while your program is running. So what if I want to create a dynamic array of 5 integer elements? So I can do that by simply multiplying 5 by the size of a single integer element. So now in my computer, the size of a single integer element is 4 bytes. So 5 times 4 is equal to 20 bytes. So 20 bytes will be dynamically allocated for my dynamic array. Because my dynamic array is storing 5 integer elements, it requires 20 bytes of space, and those 20 bytes of space will be dynamically allocated by the malloc function. And the pointer to the first byte will be stored inside the integer pointer ptr. So now since the user wants to create a dynamic array of their own size, so instead of writing 5 right here, just write size right here. So this will allocate space according to the size entered by the user. And all of this will happen during the runtime of your program. And the address of the first byte of the dynamically allocated space will be assigned to the integer pointer ptr. So now since your integer pointer ptr has the address of the first byte of your dynamically allocated space, you can use the integer pointer to assign elements to assign values to your dynamic array. So right here, I've allocated space for my dynamic array, and the malloc function returns the address of the first byte of that space, and that address is stored inside the integer pointer ptr. So now, with the help of pointer arithmetic, I can easily assign values to my dynamic array. So let me show you how I can do that. I'm going to use my for loop, and one more thing to keep in mind, in order to use the malloc function, you need to include the stdlib.h header file at the top right here. So now I'm going to assign values to my dynamic array. So I'm going to start at I is equal to 0. I'm going to go up till the size of the array, which is specified by the user. And inside the body of my for loop, I'm simply going to use pointer arithmetic, and I'm going to assign the value 45 to each element of my dynamic array. And those of you who don't know what I'm doing here, I suggest you watch my previous tutorials on pointer arithmetic and array names and pointers before you watch this tutorial. So simply I'm assigning the value 45 to each element of my dynamic array. And in the end, I'm simply going to print the contents of my dynamic array, again using my for loop. I is equal to 0, I is lesser than size, I plus plus, and simply print %d, the contents of my dynamic array at index I. So now when I run the program will first ask me to enter the size of the array. And now I'm doing this during the runtime of the program. So suppose I enter 10. So it's going to assign 10 45s to my dynamic array, and the final for loop will print the contents of my dynamic array. Similarly, I can enter any size I want. Suppose I enter 25. So this will create a dynamic array of size 25. It will assign 45 to each element of the dynamic array, and in the end, the for loop will print each element of the dynamic array. So this is all it about static and dynamic arrays. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comment section, and thanks for watching this video.